how I fit into this festival. I do use music with my program, but I'm not a musician by any means. I am certainly not a scientist, although I am married to a brilliant one. What I am is a mom, and I have a unique story that I'm going to share with you today. So about 8 years ago, Bernie and I were obliviously preparing for the birth of our first child, Lark. And at the time, I was the owner and operator of a very busy children's gymnastics franchise. And our plan was that after a short maternity leave, I would just wrap Lark up, return to work, and continue to run my business with the same vigor that I always had. And not much would change, but anybody who has a child knows that that was a pretty ridiculous plan, because we really can't anticipate how dramatically a child will change our life until that child is here, which is the case with us, but our story took a little bit more of a dramatic twist than most. Lark was born in a very perfect delivery at home, and painful and long, but perfect. And she was the most peaceful, happy baby that you ever saw, and she was reaching and exceeding all of her milestones. She was fat and healthy, she was eating, and she really was just this perfect little baby. But she had some quirks. One of her quirks was that she would roll from her back to her front at 6 weeks old, which at the time we just thought that we had super baby, that she was physically advanced. And another little quirk is when she was in her swing, which kind of cuddles them in real tight, she would roll over onto her side and her nose would stick way up in the air and like she was sniffing. And we just thought it was this cute little thing that she did. And as she got older, her breathing got louder. And I didn't want to be an overly concerned first-time mom. And the doctors told me that it was probably just tracheomalacia. If it was anything more serious, she wouldn't be exceeding all of her milestones. She wouldn't be so healthy. And so everybody just kind of brushed it off. And then when she was 5 months old, I laid her down to change her diaper. And her chest caved in about 3 inches, and she turned blue. And I screamed from the changing room for Bernie, and he came in and didn't know what was going on, and I said, she can't breathe, I don't know what to do. And we rushed her to the emergency room, where they very quickly diagnosed her with croup, and spent the next week in the hospital with them treating me like I was this overly concerned first-time mom who didn't know anything. My intuition was telling me that it wasn't croup. And we finally begged for an ENT consult, and the ENT diagnosed her with what he described as worst-case scenario tracheal anomalies. And we were air-evac'd from that hospital to Phoenix Children's Hospital, where we spent the next 4 months undergoing multiple life or death rushes and countless surgeries, one of which was a tracheostomy. So for those of you who don't know what a tracheostomy is, it's an incision placed in the neck, and a little tube called a trach is dropped into that incision, and you breathe out of that tube, which is essentially your artificial airway. They call that a trach. What did you say? Do you want to come up? I don't care. You can come stand up here if you want to. So the trach for me was pretty crushing at the time, because I felt all of my dreams and hopes that I'd had for my child vanished. We went from having a perfectly healthy child who I envisioned this life without any limitations to all of a sudden she was going to have a disability. And she was not going to be able to say words. And I remember the first time I saw her cry after she got her trach, I had to mourn the loss of her voice, because she had the tears and she had this scrunched up face and she was turning red, but there was no sound coming out. And so it was quite devastating and uniquely challenging for us also, because I mentioned I'd had a home birth, and our vision was to raise her in the most natural environment possible. And now my child she had a machine breathing for her. She had a tube feeding her. She had wires and tubes all over her body. She had these horribly perfumed plastic hospital-provided diapers that she wore that I couldn't even change that frequently because she had a urine catheter that caught all of her urine. And I remember one day the nurse came in to give her sponge bath, and she had with her the toxic death soap that the hospital uses. And I had never even used soap on her. I used oils and more natural things. And my initial reaction was, I don't want you to use that on her. And then I looked over at this stack of IVs that was going into her. And if anybody's ever seen a child recovering from major surgery, you know the stack I'm talking about. It's paralytics and antibiotics and steroids and opioids and narcotics and you name it. And my concern for not wanting to use soap seemed so petty. And I just didn't have it in me at that point to get into one more argument with the nurse about my natural choices. And so I said, you know what, just use your soap. At this point, what does it matter? And I'll never forget that nurse's response. She touched my hand, and I lifted my hung head, and she looked at me in the eye and said, you need to hang on to something. Hang on to that. I'm not going to use our soap. We'll just use whatever you want. And I'll never forget that moment. Just such a small act of kindness turned me from heartbroken, defeated mother to a fierce advocate for my daughter. This is really hard when she's standing right there. So I started standing up for myself. When my intuition was not in line with what they wanted to do, I stood up for that. When they told me, they sent a therapist into the room to show us how we were going to teach our baby to crawl on a ventilator. And I said, don't waste your time. Our baby's not going home on a ventilator. They told me that she was going to have hospital delays because of all of this time she was spending in the hospital missing that critical development phase. And I said, there's nothing wrong with her brain. We know that. We had this perfect child for 5 months at home, which I'm so grateful for because we were able to know that there's nothing wrong with her brain. If we leave the hospital with delays, we've failed her. You've failed her. When they told us that she was going to have communication delays because she was unable to speak, I said, what about sign language? And I quickly found out that my enthusiasm for sign language was not met with the same understanding amongst the medical community. Doctors are really good at keeping our kids alive and at getting them through some pretty challenging things, but they're not good at making sure they continue to develop along the same pace as everybody else. And so when we went home, we had speech therapy, feeding therapy, early intervention therapy. We had all these therapists lined up to help us out, but we didn't have sign language. And the speech therapist, she wanted to teach Lark to communicate with this picture chart. So she had all these pictures that, you know, when Lark wanted something, she would point to the pictures. And it just always felt wrong to me because, you know, the therapist said, this is a way to get her needs met. And I said, I want so much more than that. I don't want her to just have her needs met. I want to be able to have a conversation with my child. I want to be able to get inside her world. I want her to be able to express herself. I want her to have language. And by the way, there's this language out there that people don't even need a voice to use. They use their hands, and people have been using it for hundreds of years, and it's sophisticated, and it's called sign language. And why is this not something that everybody is just throwing at me? I didn't understand. And so we kind of felt like we were thrown to the wolves. And so we did the only thing we knew to do. I enrolled in some adult online courses, which were probably great if you were trying to learn to speak with adults. But when you're trying to speak with a baby, all the language that I learned just went in and out because I wasn't using it every day. So when we recognized that Lark needed a word, we would just look that word up online, would memorize the sign, and then would integrate that into our routine. And I really felt like we were doing her a disservice because it was not the full immersion approach that I think she needed, but it was the best that we could do. And it was really funny to see. She picked up very quickly that this is how we communicate. We use our hands. And so if there was ever a word that we have not given her a sign for, she would just make it up. And then we would have to guess until we figured out what she was trying to say. For example, this is Marshall, her brother. She just started doing that for Marshall, and we had to figure it out. Another time, we were at the Science Center. She was about 15 months old, and she started signing alligator. And alligator, I'm looking around for an alligator, and she pointed and signed alligator, and I was like, honey, that's an elevator. And then as soon as I said it, I realized it sounds phonetically very much like alligator. So she was signing phonetically. Another one, if we have anybody in the room who has a medical background, you'll get a kick out of this one. She started signing pool socks. And I was like, honey, I pull socks? And she shook her head, yes. And I'm like, pull socks, pull socks. You want your pull socks. We had a pulse oximeter that we called pulse ox. And she was telling me that her oxygen was low, that I needed to check her oxygen. I needed the pulse ox. And how brilliant. That wouldn't have been on a sticker chart. That wouldn't have been on a picture chart that she could point to. But because she had this language, we were able to figure it out. So anyhow, at her 18-month well baby appointment, I remember her pediatrician asked me, well, what's new with Lark? And I said, well, she's getting really good at her colors. And she looked at me like she didn't believe me. And then she looked at Lark and said, Lark, what color is that bed that you're sitting on? And Lark did that, which is the sign for red. And her pediatrician remarked that she doesn't usually ask about colors until children are 3 years old. And here she was, 18 months old, supposed to be delayed. And she's doing things that 3-year-olds do. And at that appointment, Lark had about 150 signs that she was using, and she was starting to put those signs together into 2-word sentences, which, if anybody knows 18-month-olds, that is advanced in communication. And I just thought I had the most brilliant child in the world. Here she was, she had all of this hospital delay, and she still was ahead of the curve when it comes to communication, and she is brilliant, don't get me wrong. But now that I know what I know about sign language and its effects on the developing brain, I understand why she ended up like that. And then when Lark was not quite 2 years old, I had Marshall. And Marshall is a very typical boy in every sense of the word. And he was just born into a signing environment. So it's been really fun for us to see the benefits of sign language on a typical child, as well as a child who medically needs it. Marshall started signing before he started speaking, which is very typical. If a child is given both languages, sign language is easier and they use that first. And he signed pretty exclusively until about 18 months old, and then he started speaking. But when Marshall started speaking, it wasn't mom, dad, ball. He started speaking in sentences. It just came all at once. And then once he started speaking and his spoken language evolved, the sign language kind of trailed off. And so now he's at a point where it's really interesting. His receptive language is fluent. So he can be like in a group of deaf people with all of this language going on, and he's picking up on all the language, and it's fascinating to me because he can't always sign back. Even though he understands everything that's coming in, he can't always sign it back, but he is able to interpret for his sister, which is such a wonderful gift. When we go to park or we go to a new environment, he can let the other kids know what she's trying to say. And also, both of them have the benefit of being multilingual or bilingual. Hopefully someday they'll be multilingual. And they have a bilingual brain. And what that means, once I learned this, I felt so much better about myself, because Spanish, I took 4 years of Spanish, and I am nowhere near fluent. And it was always one of those subjects that I struggled with, and I was pretty good at school. I always got good grades. I didn't struggle very much, but Spanish really kicked my booty. And but what happens is, if you are raised with one language, which if you were raised in the United States, there's a really good chance that's all you had, your brain becomes very plastic. There's this critical language acquisition window from the birth until about the age of 5 or 6 that kind of closes. Whatever happens in that window has the greatest bearing on the rest of your life as far as language goes. So if you only had one language, your brain thinks this is the only way to communicate. And then later on, trying to acquire different languages is really challenging. But if you're raised with just 2 languages, whether it's English or Spanish or English and Sign Language or German and Chinese, if there's more than one language, then your brain is open to multiple forms of communication, and then later on, acquiring multiple languages becomes a lot easier. That's why if you know somebody that knows Spanish and English, they can pick up German or Chinese or whatever, and it's easy for them, and that's why. So Marshall has the benefit of being bilingual as well, which is amazing. So when Lark was about 4 years old, I took her to an indoor playground, and she encountered another child her age. And what happens when you have a child without a voice, or a child who's deaf, or a child who's different in general, when they're toddlers, it's not that big of a problem because they just parallel play anyway. But as they get older, you see that gap between them and their peers start to appear. And so 4 years old, that gap was pretty prominent, and I took her to an indoor playground, and she encountered another child her age, and she immediately dropped down to her hands and knees and started wagging her tail and panting. And the little girl said, "Oh, hi, puppy." And the two of them went off together and played. And this is something that I had observed her doing many times before. And I don't know why it all of a sudden hit me in this moment. She never did this at home. She never did this with her friends who she was familiar with. This is something that she only did in a new environment. And it's because at 4 years old, she realized that kids don't know how to relate to a child without a voice, but they know how to relate to a puppy. And so by pretending to be a puppy, she was bridging that gap, and she was able to make friends. And you can imagine that this revelation was, on the one hand, it was heartbreaking because it was so unfair that given everything she had to go through, she was literally enabling children to treat her like a dog so that she could make friends. But on the other hand, I was so proud because she was so smart that she wasn't going to let that gap be in the way between her and making friends, and she found a way around it. But later that day, I went online to order more signing time videos, and I saw a link, click to become an instructor, and I remember thinking, like, duh, like, why have I never thought about this? I had this huge background of child development, and that's what I did my entire adult life until I had children, and now I have this new language, and I understand all of this, and there's nobody out there doing this, and I know that because we were begging for sign language classes. We were looking everywhere, and nobody was doing this. And so by the time Bernie came home from work that day, I had written up the whole business plan. I had already called the owner, the founder of the company. I knew this is what I was meant to do. And so I started teaching classes, and for the last 2.5 years, I've been doing a mobile program. So I go around to local businesses or homes and moms groups or birthing centers, and I teach classes, and it's mostly to babies. But I have done classes for older kids and everywhere in between. But I'm in the process of forming a 501c3 nonprofit so that I can open my own brick and mortar. And the reason that I'm doing a nonprofit is because sign language is beneficial to all children. I've seen it. I know firsthand. All kids can benefit from it. They love it. It's fun. There's no reason that anybody shouldn't learn sign language. But for children who have a developmental delay, for children with cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, apraxia of speech, autism, tracheostomies, deafness, I could go on and on and on. Learning sign language can be life-changing for them, and it's not a resource that is readily available. So I want to be that resource, and I want to have scholarship funds set aside for these families so that money will not be a barrier for them to attend classes alongside all of the typically developing children as well. So that is my story. That's what got me here. And so now we're going to have a little bit more fun, and we're going to learn the colors of the rainbow.